Shopify is a global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business and sell more with less effort thanks to the Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/redcircle, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/redcircle now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/redcircle.
The sun's shining, birds are singing, and all feels right in the world.
Until the season changes, and suddenly you lose your motivation to get out of bed. In fact, 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the season or time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all, because we want you to live your best life and be your best you all year round.
Please visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.
You know who you are? Steeven is my name. Even Steeven.
Will you say something, Steeven?
Steeven or Else Media.
Imagine that it's the morning of September 17th, 1983. You're 11 years old, and while the sun may not be up quite yet, you certainly are. Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and all in for a bit of something that you, in your heart of hearts, consider to be more than a little sacred as you move about in the quiet hours of the morning as the rest of the house sleeps. You're up early for one reason and one reason only. It's Saturday morning, and that means cartoons. You shuffle into the kitchen, stifle a yawn, and go straight for the cupboard between the sink and the fridge. You pull open the cupboard doors, and ignoring the double stack of gleaming white Corelle bowls that are front and center, you reach in just a bit further and grab what's behind them. You need a stool to get this part done, but it's worth the extra effort as you pull out what, in your small hands, might as well be something used to serve up punch at a party. It's big, it's orange, and it's all yours. Your special bowl. The one that's perfect for an endless amount of cereal. Next comes a box of Fruity Pebbles, and tipping it over the bowl, you shake it just enough to ensure that you get the perfect amount of those colorful, sugary little wafer-thin stones. You pour until the bowl is nearly overflowing and top it off with ice-cold milk from the fridge, careful not to let it spill over the sides. And though it looks like it might spill out all over the counter at any given moment, you know that it won't. After all, you know what you're doing. This ain't your first rodeo. And so, bowl in hand and spoon in mouth, you make your way to the living room. You pick a space just a few inches away from the TV screen and sit yourself down, moving carefully to avoid spilling any of the cereal on the shag carpet. Then, getting yourself all situated, you reach up and switch on the TV. The warm glow from the screen fills the room, and as you take your first bite of cereal, it feels like everything is right in the world. After a week of grade school full of math quizzes, spelling tests, and recess politics, Saturday morning is your reward. For just a few precious hours, the stresses of school disappear, and it's just you, your cereal, and the cartoons. But this Saturday is different. Today is special. You've been counting down the days for the premiere of Dungeons & Dragons on CBS. And so you inhale another healthy spoonful of Fruity Pebbles, your eyes glued to the screen as the show begins. The intro plays, and it is everything you hoped for. 6 kids, 1 roller coaster ride, and suddenly they're transported to a world full of magic, monsters, and danger. There's something about it that immediately clicks. Maybe it's because you and your friends have been talking about Dungeons & Dragons for months. Maybe it's the promise of adventure, or maybe, just maybe, it's because this world of dragons and wizards feels like an escape from the routine of school and homework, a place where you can be the hero. This is what Saturday mornings are made for. The best cartoons, the coolest characters, and just enough imagination to carry you through to the next weekend. From Steeven or Else Media, this is episode 1 of Growing Up Geek, the birth of Saturday morning cartoons. Hello and welcome to Growing Up Geek, the podcast that is so steeped in nostalgia that it still cries when it thinks about the blockbuster up the street that no longer exists. I'm your host, my name is Steeven, and I'll be your pilot on this temporal odyssey through the geek-centric cultural zeitgeist of my youth. From the 70s through the 80s and on into the 90s, we're going to explore the movies, the music, the books, the comics, and the TV shows that shaped my childhood and made me, well, me. And what better way to begin than by diving into a beloved childhood ritual, Saturday morning cartoons. You know, it's hard to believe in this day and age of on-demand entertainment that there was ever a time that, if you wanted to watch the Super Friends, for example, you had to be in front of the TV on a certain day at a certain time. Otherwise, you'd miss it. That is, unless you were lucky enough to catch it a few months later as a rerun. But that's just how it was back then. For a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s like I did, cartoon watching was divided into two distinct time frames. You had one batch of cartoons you could watch every weekday, both before and after school. Definitely a subject for a future episode. And then there was a completely different batch of cartoons reserved for Saturday mornings. While the weekday shows included some of my all-time favorites like G.I. Joe, Transformers, Voltron, and Robotech, there was just something special about watching cartoons on a Saturday morning. But we'll get into that in a bit. First, I want you to prepare your minds for an epic journey through time and space as we delve into the rich history of Saturday morning cartoons, a beloved tradition that spanned over 5 decades and left an indelible mark on generations of kids just like me. So buckle up, ladies and gentlemen. First stop, the decade where it all began. Beatlemania swept the globe, color television revolutionized living rooms, and the space race put a man on the moon. Turn your dials to adventure, folks. We're going to the 1960s. All right, now, before we can jump into the explosion of Saturday morning cartoons in the 1960s, we need to step back and look at the larger history of television and animation. Television itself was still a relatively new medium in the early 1950s, and while live-action programming dominated, there was a clear gap in content aimed specifically at children. Early television was finding its footing with a mix of radio shows adapted for the small screen and live variety programs. But where did animated content fit into this picture? To understand that, we have to go back to the golden age of theatrical cartoon shorts from the 1930s and 40s. Before TV became the dominant form of home entertainment, kids and families flocked to theaters to watch cartoon shorts that played before feature films. This was the era of Looney Tunes, Merry Melodies, and Popeye, with characters like Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Porky Pig dominating the screen.
Say, what is that? A percolator on a roller skate?
Bet my Tootsie can beat his old silverfish.
These animated shorts were wildly popular and often packed with humor, slapstick, and even some subtle adult-oriented satire. Audiences loved the antics of characters like Mighty Mouse, Tom and Jerry, and Betty Boop. And it wasn't long before the network saw the potential to repurpose these shorts for television. As television sets began making their way into American homes in the late 1940s and early 50s, networks scrambled to fill airtime. Theatrical cartoon shorts provided an easy way to entertain children without the need for original production. Classic characters like Bugs Bunny and Popeye made their television debuts, becoming staples of early children's programming. The marriage of television and animation was inevitable, but something new was on the horizon. Cartoons made exclusively for the TV screen. This brings us to Crusader Rabbit, which holds a special place in television history as the first cartoon specifically created for television.
When we left our little hero Crusader Rabbit last time, he had just received word that the state of Texas was planning a campaign to rid herself of every last jackrabbit within her boundaries. Well, you can imagine how that set with our boy Crusader.
Premiering in 1950, Crusader Rabbit was a simple but groundbreaking series that featured a rabbit embarking on various adventures. Though the animation was limited, the show set the stage for a whole new wave of cartoons designed to fit within TV's episodic format. In many ways, Crusader Rabbit was a prototype for what Saturday morning cartoons would later become, introducing the concept of serialized, made-for-TV animation that could hold children's attention week after week. By the time we entered the 1960s, TV networks were catching on to the idea that there was a massive, untapped audience in the form of kids glued to their screens on Saturday mornings. So picture this. It's the early 1960s. Television is still a relatively new phenomenon, with color TV just starting to gain traction in American households. There are only 3 networks, and all 3 of them, ABC, NBC, and CBS, are locked in a competitive race to figure out how to fill their weekend programming schedules. This is a time when kids were typically at home on Saturday mornings while their parents slept in or got caught up on weekend chores. Well, it didn't take long for network executives to recognize that this block of time was prime real estate. With millions of young, impressionable viewers waking up early and searching for entertainment, the idea of targeting children with dedicated programming emerged. Thus, Saturday morning cartoons were born.
Calling all kids. Calling all kids. Keep an eye out for these 2 birds. One calls himself Heckle, the other Jekyll. They're a pair of real comedians. There's another bird following them, the world's funniest penguin. He goes under the name of Tennessee Tuxedo. Back then, the network started by airing reruns of older animated shows like The Flintstones and the Jetsons, both of which originally premiered in prime time. The Flintstones, in fact, holds the distinction of being one of the first animated series aimed at an adult audience in its primetime slot, often compared to modern-day sitcoms like The Simpsons or Family Guy for its time.
How's the air up there, girls?
It's getting thin, Fred, just like my patient.
But something happened as these reruns aired on Saturday mornings. The kids loved them. The humor, the bright colors, and the fantastical storylines resonated with a younger audience. Soon enough, networks realized they had a gold mine on their hands. They could keep kids entertained and glued to their screens for hours, giving advertisers a direct line to households across the country. Thus began a trend that would dominate American culture for decades: the Saturday morning cartoon block. The reruns were just the start. The success of the Flintstones and the Jetsons led to the production of original content created specifically for Saturday mornings. Shows like Space Ghost, The Herculoids, and Johnny Quest introduced kids to a new breed of action-packed science fiction adventure cartoons. These shows were more than just entertainment. They captured the imagination of a generation, offering tales of outer space, daring missions, and heroic feats.
There's a good target for us, Race. Those bats carrying chemicals, it could create a diversion.
But with this exciting new wave of programming came a rising tide of concern. Parents and advocacy groups began to voice their unease about the levels of violence portrayed in these shows. Characters often engaged in epic battles, firing ray guns and fighting monstrous creatures, sparking debates about whether such content was appropriate for young, impressionable minds.
By synthesizing this plant into pills, a crew could keep mentally alert for as long as 20 years.
Yes, Doctor.
Unfortunately, the use of this pill could be abused.
This concern led to the formation of watchdog groups like Action for Children's Television, or ACT. They campaigned for stricter regulations on what could and could not be shown to kids. It was a cultural tug of war. On one side, the networks were eager to push boundaries, experimenting with fantastical storytelling and increasingly elaborate animation to capture the attention of their audience. On the other side, parents, teachers, and psychologists feared that the action-heavy content might be too intense for children, potentially leading to aggressive behavior. This debate over what constituted appropriate children's programming would influence the development of Saturday morning cartoons for decades to come. Despite the concerns, the 1960s were a pivotal time for Saturday morning television. Shows like Underdog and Rocky and Bullwinkle emerged, combining humor and satire with kid-friendly storytelling.
The giant cats of the planet Felina had taken all the cows on Earth and captured Sweet Polly to milk them. And now they had the mighty Underdog in The Rubber Trap.
These cartoons not only entertained, but also snuck in clever references to current events, politics, and pop culture, planting the seeds of subversive humor that would be a hallmark of animation for years to come.
Our subject for today is how to be a beatnik. Some people think the beatnik is merely a bum with sunglasses, but he is more than that, though not much.
As the decade progressed, more and more shows found their home in the Saturday morning lineup, solidifying this time slot as a sacred ritual for kids. Every Saturday, children across the country would race to the living room, breakfast in hand, ready for their weekly escape into animated worlds filled with superheroes, talking animals, and futuristic landscapes. But change was in the air. What began as a way to repurpose primetime reruns for kids quickly became something much bigger. By the time the decade wrapped up, animated heroes and adventure series had captured the hearts of millions. But concerns about violence had planted seeds of change. As the 1970s dawned, the industry was on the verge of transformation, one driven by a rising demand for more educational and socially responsible content. And so, as we leave the 1960s and step into the groovy 70s, grab your cereal, folks, because Saturday mornings were about to become a blend of life lessons and laughs, all wrapped up in animation. Growing Up Geek will be back after these messages.
Shopify is a global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business and sell more with less effort thanks to the Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/redcircle, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/redcircle now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/redcircle.
Step into the savage world of the Hyborian Age and journey through a land of sorcery, steel, and epic adventure with me, Steeven Orr, on Hither Came Conan. Together we'll explore the legendary Conan the Barbarian comic series from Marvel Comics, starting with the groundbreaking first issue from 1970 and working our way through each epic tale, one issue at a time. Along the way, I'll also dive into any other Conan comics I can get my hands on, because when it comes to the titular Cimmerian, there's no such thing as too much adventure. Whether you're a diehard Conan fan or just discovering the greatest barbarian of all time, this podcast is your gateway to the blood-soaked battlefields, treacherous kingdoms, and forgotten treasures of Robert E. Howard's timeless creation. New episodes are packed with action, insights, and a little humor, all dedicated to the world of Conan and the creators who brought him to life on the comic book page. So sharpen your swords and subscribe to Hither Came Conan today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Crom demands it! And now back to Growing Up Geek. Fast forward to the 1970s and you'll find a landscape of Saturday morning cartoons that have undergone a noticeable shift. The concerns about violent content raised in the previous decade hadn't just lingered, they'd intensified. Parents' advocacy groups like Action for Children's Television were becoming louder and more organized, calling for stricter regulations on the types of shows aimed at children. In response, networks were under immense pressure to rethink their programming strategy. The result? A move toward more educational and socially conscious content. Instead of abandoning cartoons altogether, the network sought a compromise, aiming to blend entertainment with education. One of the most successful examples of this shift was Schoolhouse Rock, a series of short educational cartoons that aired between the main shows. With its unforgettable tunes and clever animations, Schoolhouse Rock was an instant hit, whether it was teaching grammar through Conjunction Junction or American civics with I'm Just a Bill. These segments entertained while sneaking in lessons that would stick with kids for years.
Hey, there's a telegraph line. You got yours and I got mine. It's called the nervous system, and everybody understands those telegram commands, and you know that everybody better listen.
One of the standout shows from the 1970s was Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids. Created and voiced by Bill Cosby, this animated series broke new ground by focusing on the everyday lives of African American kids growing up in urban neighborhoods. It was more than just a cartoon. It was a show that gave kids of color a chance to see themselves reflected on the screen, and it tackled real-life issues like bullying, poverty, and peer pressure in a way that was accessible and meaningful. Fat Albert was all about teaching valuable lessons about friendship, responsibility, and respect, offering a positive message to kids who were often left out of the mainstream media. But looking back, there's a difficult truth that we can't ignore. While Fat Albert played a crucial role in shaping the childhoods of so many, the legacy of its creator, Bill Cosby, has been forever tarnished by his later criminal actions. Cosby's conviction as a serial rapist in the 2000s forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that a man who once used his platform to promote positive values and education betrayed the trust of so many. In many ways, Fat Albert exists in this strange juxtaposition where the show's message of kindness and community can still resonate, but its creator stands as a reminder that the people behind the art can fall far short of the ideals they promote. Even so, for many kids in the 1970s, Fat Albert remains a landmark in television history for breaking barriers and giving kids important lessons in both life and representation.
And I'm gonna sing a song for you, and Bill's gonna show you a thing or two. You'll have some fun now with me and all the gang, learning from each other while we do our thing.
Another show with a similar ethos was The Electric Company.
Hey, you guys!
Airing on PBS from 1971 to 1977, it mixed live-action skits, animation, and musical numbers to improve literacy and encourage curiosity. The show boasted a stellar cast, including a young Morgan Freeman, and managed to strike that balance between educational and entertaining that defined much of 1970s children programming. And yes, I know that The Electric Company was not a Saturday morning show, but it is a prime example of how networks and creators were using children's television as a form of edutainment. Plus, on a personal level, the show introduced me to the character of Spider-Man, my second most favorite comic book superhero of all time, and a character who played a pivotal role in shaping me into the person I am today. So yeah, know that there is more to be said about The Electric Company and the impact it had not just on my life, but on the life of others. We'll just be doing that in a future episode. For now, I believe we're talking about Saturday morning cartoons in the 70s, which were all about finding that sweet spot between keeping parents happy and keeping kids glued to the screen. Educational content was great, but the networks knew they couldn't veer too far from what made Saturday mornings a hit in the first place. Pure fun. Shows like Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Were perfect examples of how to straddle that line. While Scooby-Doo technically premiered in 1969, it became a massive hit in the 70s, spawning countless spin-offs and becoming an iconic part of the Saturday morning lineup. With its blend of humor, mystery, and just a little bit of spookiness, Scooby-Doo had kids coming back week after week to see the gang solve yet another mystery. Meanwhile, the variety show format was also flourishing, and nothing captured the chaotic, zany energy of the 70s quite like the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. With a mix of live-action segments, music, and animated shorts, the Banana Splits brought a sense of irreverence to Saturday mornings that appealed to both kids and adults alike. Who could forget that earworm of a theme song or the costume characters racing through slapstick gags before cutting to animated favorites like Arabian Nights or the Three Musketeers?
Tra-la-la, la-la-la-la, tra-la-la.
The 70s were a decade of experimentation and balance. Shows were still full of adventure and action, but now they were more often wrapped in a more conscientious package. And while cartoons had become more socially aware, that didn't mean the fun was lost. Whether kids were jamming to the catchy tunes of Schoolhouse Rock, solving mysteries with Scooby and the Gang, or laughing along with Fat Albert, Saturday mornings remained the ultimate playground for the imagination. But the 70s weren't just about learning or solving mysteries. This was also the era when superheroes began to dominate the screen. Super Friends premiered in 1973 and became an immediate hit.
In the great hall of the Justice League, there are assembled the world's 4 greatest heroes, created from the cosmic legends of the universe.
Bringing together DC Comics' most iconic characters, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and more, on one screen. The show became a Saturday morning juggernaut, inspiring multiple spin-offs and cementing its place in cartoon history. By the time the 70s were drawing to a close, Saturday mornings had solidified their place as a cornerstone of childhood, balancing education, action, and heart. But as we entered the 80s, everything was about to get bigger, bolder, and more commercialized. The lessons and balance of the 70s set the stage, but the 1980s took everything to the next level. With the rise of deregulation, toy companies saw an opportunity, and Saturday morning cartoons became a whole new kind of playground, one where every adventure was powered by action figures and brand tie-ins. So let's grab our capes, strap on our proton packs, and dive headfirst into the colorful, toy-driven world of 80s Saturday mornings. The 80s, a time of big hair, bigger egos, and an obsession with materialism that defined an entire generation. It was the decade of excess, of bright neon colors, and of course, rampant corporate greed. The 1980s were also a defining era for Saturday morning cartoons because beneath the surface of colorful characters and fantastical adventures lay the ever-present force of commercialism, a direct reflection of the larger political and economic climate of the time. With Ronald Reagan in the White House and the rise of deregulation, corporate America seized the opportunity to market to children like never before. The Federal Communications Commission loosened its restrictions on advertising to kids, opening the floodgates for a new breed of cartoons, ones that weren't just entertaining, but designed to sell toys, merchandise, and a lifestyle driven by consumption. This was the era of capitalism gone wild, and nowhere was that more apparent than in cartoons. Weekday afternoons were filled with toy-driven shows like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, G.I. Joe, Jem and the Holograms, and Transformers. But the same forces were at work on Saturday mornings.
Saturday, sail into supersonic capers on the all-new adventures of Mighty Mouse and Heckle and Jekyll. Next, it's the Tom and Jerry Comedy Show, followed by that crazy Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Show. Then Gangway for the all-new Popeye Hour. Next, Track Pack, the monsters that are on your side. Then it's the new Fat Albert Show, followed by the Ape Man and the Masked Man on the Tarzan Lone Ranger Adventure Hour. Then explore your world on 30 minutes. Catch it all Saturday on CBS.
These weren't just cartoons. They were a reflection of Reagan's America, a time when corporate profits took precedence and kids became a key demographic in the burgeoning consumer economy. Though He-Man and its ilk didn't air on Saturday mornings, they exemplified the commercialism that influenced every corner of kids' programming. Saturday mornings, once the domain of more whimsical, family-friendly fare, became a battleground for companies to sell products. Take the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians. On the surface, it was a fun superhero show featuring the likes of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But behind the scenes, it was little more than a thinly veiled commercial for Kenner's Superpower Collection action figures.
The Superpowers Collection, Superman, Batman, Brainiac, Hawkman, and other figures with power action, each sold separately, new from Kenner.
And it wasn't just superheroes. Comic strip characters like Heathcliff and Garfield found new life on Saturday mornings, not because they were clamoring for animated adaptations, but because their creators saw the potential to expand their licensing deals into toys, lunchboxes, backpacks, and more. The lines between entertainment and advertising blurred so completely in the 80s that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Cartoons became extended commercials designed to hook kids on a storyline while enticing them to beg their parents for the related products. Star Wars droids and Star Wars Ewoks were perfect examples of this.
Stay back, you grease bucket!
Riding the wave of Star Wars mania, these shows filled the gap between movies, not out of a deep desire to expand the lore, but to keep the franchise alive in the public consciousness. And more importantly, keep the action figures moving off the store shelves. And it wasn't just action figures. By the mid-'80s, video games had taken over suburban malls, and soon enough, cartoons were there to capitalize. Saturday Supercade, Pac-Man, Dragon's Lair, and Pole Position weren't about rich narratives or character development. They were about selling arcade games, home consoles, and quarter after quarter to a generation of kids already obsessed with video games.
That's a real cute costume, Grump. I didn't know it was Halloween. Yow!
It's not Halloween, Pac-Man. And why are you pulling on that man's mustache?
These shows didn't just bridge the gap between the arcade and the living room, they monetized it. Then there were shows that simply capitalized on the popularity of existing TV shows and movies. Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling took the over-the-top theatrics of professional wrestling and mixed it with animated hijinks to keep Hulk Hogan's brand front and center in kids' minds. Meanwhile, live-action hits like Alf, Punky Brewster, Mork and Mindy, and Fonz and the Happy Days Gang were given cartoon adaptations. Not because anyone was clamoring for them, but because networks and toy companies knew they could squeeze a few more bucks out of already popular franchises by repackaging them for younger audiences. But if there was any place where the commercialism of Saturday morning cartoons reached its peak, it was the rise of toy-based cartoons. Shows like Pound Puppies, Rubik the Amazing Cube, and My Pet Monster weren't about telling stories. They were about creating lovable characters that kids could take home in plush toy or action figure form.
Sorry. Rubik forgot.
Even Dungeons & Dragons, with its darker, more mature tone, was designed to sell the popular tabletop game, tapping into the growing fantasy and role-playing craze.
But beware, for only beauty can defeat the eye of the beholder.
It didn't matter what the premise was, as long as there was a product to push. And of course, there were the Smurfs.
Do you have any intellectually stimulating tasks for me to smurf today? Something earth-shaking that will change life as we know it? Something with sweeping effects on the course of Smurf history?
The little blue creatures dominated Saturday mornings, not just as a beloved cartoon, but as a merchandising juggernaut. Every kid knew the characters, and every kid wanted a Smurf figurine, t-shirt, or lunchbox. The Smurfs weren't just a cultural phenomenon. They were a finely tuned marketing machine, pushing merchandise at an unprecedented rate and proving that even the most seemingly innocent cartoon could be turned into a capitalist gold mine. The 80s were also a time of nostalgia repackaged for the next generation. Shows like The Jetsons and The Flintstones reemerged, often accompanied by a fresh wave of merchandise. Even classic superheroes like Superman and Batman were transformed into marketing powerhouses, their likenesses plastered on lunchboxes, toys, and more. But it wasn't just about nostalgia, it was about profitability. Networks and corporations recognized the enduring appeal of these characters and exploited it for the maximum commercial gain. Not every show on Saturday mornings was a blatant cash grab, though. Shows like Pee-wee's Playhouse broke the mold, mixing live-action segments with bizarre animated shorts to create a surreal, countercultural experience.
Now we get that you feel warning. It's gonna be that kind of morning. We're being wacky. We're getting naughty. Now it's cuckoo at Pee-wee's Playhouse.
While Pee-wee's World may not have been as overtly commercial as He-Man or G.I. Joe, it still became a massive hit, appealing to both kids and adults, and showing that even amidst the corporate frenzy, there was room for creativity and weirdness.
Sure hope you had fun today. I certainly did. And remember, everybody, be really careful with your macaroni. You don't want to get it all over.
But Saturday mornings in the 80s weren't just about entertainment. They were a lesson in capitalism. These cartoons taught kids that everything, whether it was a superhero, a video game, or a small blue creature living in a mushroom house, could be commodified. The line between cartoon and commercial became so blurred that kids didn't even notice it anymore. And that was exactly the point. The deregulation of the 80s created a perfect storm for networks and toy companies to rake in massive profits, and they did so with wild abandon. And you know what? I was a huge part of that. I went from 7 to 17 in the 80s. These were my formative years. I was a child of the 80s, plain and simple. And despite the corporate greed, despite what these shows meant for CEOs and their bottom line, I still look back at this time with more than just mere fondness. Speaking strictly on Saturday morning cartoons, when I think of my top 5, heck, my top 10 most favorite Saturday morning cartoons of all time, over 50% of the list comes straight out of the 80s. So don't get me wrong, folks, despite what it might sound like, the 80s were my favorite decade for Saturday morning cartoons. But I do think that it is important to acknowledge what those Saturday mornings really represented. The blending of entertainment and commerce in ways that hadn't been seen before. It was a bold experiment, one that defined a generation, my generation, and one that left a lasting impact on both television and consumer culture. However, as we move toward the 90s, the 80s excess would give way to something new. The rise of cable television and the proliferation of cartoon networks like Nickelodeon and the Cartoon Network meant that kids no longer had to wait for Saturday mornings to get their animation fix. Weekday afternoon blocks like Fox Kids and the Disney Afternoon brought beloved shows like DuckTales, Tiny Toon Adventures, and Batman the Animated Series into the mix, chipping away at the dominance of Saturday mornings. The commercialism that had defined the 80s didn't go away, it simply evolved. But with more options available thanks to cable TV, Saturday mornings began to lose their magic. The exclusive window of animated entertainment that once dominated kids' lives became less special, as cartoons could now be watched at any time of the day, 7 days a week. The rise of 24/7 children's programming combined with the after-school cartoon blocks meant that Saturday morning's reign as the ultimate cartoon time was coming to an end. What the 80s left behind was a blueprint for how to commodify childhood entertainment, a model that would continue into the 90s and beyond. But as we step into the new decade, it's clear that the rules were changing. The innocence of Saturday morning cartoons would give way to a more sophisticated and diverse slate of programming. But the lessons learned from the Reagan era's unapologetic embrace of capitalism would continue to shape the world of animation for years to come. Growing Up Geek will be back after these messages. Are you looking for a podcast that dives into the very beginnings of the Man of Steel? Then check out the Superman Super Show. My name is Steeven, and along with Ed Moore, we're just a couple of guys separated by 1,000 miles of geography who like to read comics. Now, we don't claim to be experts on Superman or the golden age of comics, but we're on a mission to read every single Superman story from his earliest adventures, one comic book at a time. And each episode will take you back to the golden age where Superman's journey began. From his first leaps over tall buildings to battling mad scientists and mobsters, we break down every story, sharing our thoughts, insights, and laughs along the way. New episodes drop every 2 weeks. So whether you're a longtime Superman fan or just curious about his roots, we invite you to join us on this incredible journey through comic book history. Find the Superman Super Show wherever you listen to podcasts and start exploring the golden age of Superman with us today. And now back to Growing Up Geek. And there we have it, folks, a journey through 3 decades of Saturday morning cartoons. From the first experiments in the 1960s with shows like Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Jetsons, and the Flintstones, we saw networks realizing the potential of Saturday mornings as prime real estate for captivating young audiences. This was an era defined by experimentation, with pioneering studios like Hanna-Barbera leading the charge, creating characters that would become icons of American pop culture, pushing the boundaries of what cartoons could be. It was a time of innovation and social consciousness, with shows like Fat Albert and Schoolhouse Rock aiming not just to entertain, but to educate and inspire. These weren't just cartoons. They were attempts to reflect and address the changing culture of the times. And for many of us, they were the first places we encountered stories that blended fun with a message. Then came the 1980s, a decade that shifted gears into a new era of commercialism and unapologetic consumerism. With the loosening of regulations, Saturday morning cartoons evolved into a full-blown marketing machine. It was an age of spectacle, of toy-driven narratives, and larger-than-life characters that weren't just on our screens. They were lining store shelves in the form of action figures, lunchboxes, and everything in between. Shows like The Smurfs, Dungeons & Dragons, and the Superpowers team Galactic Guardians might have been fun to watch, but they also taught us something about the power of marketing and capitalism. Saturday morning cartoons in the 80s were vibrant, memorable, and a little bit controversial as they blurred the lines between entertainment and advertising like never before. These 3 decades laid the groundwork for a phenomenon that became a staple of American childhood. Whether it was teaching us life lessons, introducing us to the thrill of fantasy and adventure, or simply giving us a reason to wake up early every weekend, Saturday morning cartoons became more than just a lineup of shows. They became part of our culture. As we wrap up this episode, it's clear that Saturday mornings didn't just entertain. They defined a part of our lives, shaping our imaginations, filling our cereal-fueled mornings with laughter, lessons, and unforgettable characters. Each decade left its mark, creating memories that many of us still hold close. But while we've covered a lot of ground, the story isn't over. Not quite yet. On the next episode of Growing Up Geek, we continue our journey through Saturday morning history with a look at the 1990s, a decade that saw cartoons take on a new level of sophistication and creativity. We'll explore how cable networks, after-school programming blocks, and changes in animation styles shifted the landscape, leading us into the 2000s and ultimately the slow demise of Saturday morning cartoons in the 2010s. The magic of Saturday mornings may have faded, but its legacy endures. Join me as we dive into the final chapters of this story next time on episode 2 of Growing Up Geek, the death of Saturday morning cartoons. Plus, I'm going to be counting down my top 5 Saturday morning cartoons of all time. So grab your cereal, mark your calendar, and get ready for a nostalgia-packed adventure. I'll see you next Saturday. Well, not Saturday. I mean, the episodes release on Tuesday, but you know what I mean. Bye. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Growing Up Geek. Questions and comments can be directed to growingupgeekpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can help to boost our presence online by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. I also invite you to join our subscription program, Steeven or Else Beyond, and in return, you'll get episodes of Growing Up Geek early and ad-free. Check out the link in the show notes, or just go to growingupgeekpodcast.com to sign up today. Growing Up Geek is a presentation of Steeven or Else Media. For more nerdy content hosted by me, check out SteevenOrElse.com.
I just don't think I can move through life knowing that a guy named Steeven did this to me.
How could you let this happen, Steeven?
Your podcast sucks.
Hail to the king, baby.
Steeven! Thank God. I had a horrible feeling I was going to be the only one here.